All right, welcome back to another episode of Power Five Blitz podcast. It's been a few weeks for sure since we were able to record. We both have busy lives, but it should be an exciting week of football this week. It's been exciting past few weeks
Mhm.
since we recorded last on and off the field, but we're not going to get into the off the field stuff. Um, but starting off, the college football playoff rankings came out a couple weeks ago,
Mhm.
and I've seen a lot of back and forth on who should be number one. So you know, I kind of want to hear your opinion on who you think should be number one and if Ohio State's the rightful team to hold the number one spot right now.
I think the number I could get behind either Georgia or Michigan. If you wanted to present arguments for either of those teams for number one, I really struggle to get behind Ohio State. Yeah, they have a few good wins against Penn State and Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's kind of shown some cracks, and they did not deserve to win that Notre Dame game. And then Penn State um, is I tell people Penn State's kind of like your typical Iowa team in that the offense is about average, and then the defense is really, really good. So the Penn State is a good team, but I don't think they're as good as people think they are. Um, so I just don't get why they're number one. I think they're the third best team. I do think they're the clear number three. But I really think right now your only two teams that have really a case to be number one is both Michigan and Georgia. And obviously you'll learn a lot more about Michigan this weekend as they play Penn State. But those are kind of the two teams I think are above the rest of the country. And so I was very surprised to see them put Ohio State at number one.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. How I kind of view it and what I've been telling people the past couple of weeks since the rankings came out is, yeah, resume is it's an important part. Like Michigan hasn't played a hard schedule,
Mm.
Georgia hasn't played that hard of a schedule, and Ohio State's played a tougher one. But I view it as what do you see on the field and who would beat who on a neutral field right now?
Mhm.
And right now, I mean, Michigan's favored at home by like I think 7 points against Ohio State. And I was reading something that someone used some analytical tool, and Michigan would be favored against Georgia right now by a couple points. To me, Georgia's the number one team. With the eye test, they look much better the past few weeks than they did to start the year. And they have a couple resume boosters over Michigan. But
Mhm.
when I watch Ohio State compared to when I watch Michigan or Georgia, I see a team that's a step below those two right now. Um, in terms of really good defense and everything, but their offense is not like their offense of the past. They have Marvin Harrison, great. Henderson's coming on the past few weeks, but Kyle McCord is not very good at quarterback, in my
Mhm.
opinion. I don't think he's a bad player, but I don't think he's anything special. And when I watch Michigan and Georgia, they just look dominant on both sides of the ball right now. Michigan has all year. So to me, it's really the eye test, which is the big thing on why I think Georgia should be one, Michigan two, and then
Mhm.
Ohio State at number three, just like you said. I just when I watch the games, I don't view Ohio State as the best team. I think there's a handful of teams in the top 10 that would probably beat them right now.
Mhm. Yeah, like I said, I think resume is important, but at the same time, I think it's more of what you do,
Mhm.
or how you do it, as opposed to like what you actually do. Um, you see all the time, teams that maybe win a game or two they're not supposed to, and then towards the end of the year, whenever teams start seeing their cracks, they kind of falter out. Not saying Ohio State's going to be one of those teams, but I do think that especially early in the year, you should really shouldn't, especially as the year goes on, hold those wins with as much weight as how they're playing down the stretch, especially in conference play.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Um, but moving along, talking about Penn State, we can jump to this topic. You mentioned their
Mhm.
offense has been pretty bad, and they're about to play a really good defense this week. But
Yep.
what do you think their issue is on offense? Because they have a lot of young talent on offense with the Singleton, Allen, Aller, Lambert Smith. What do you think their issue is right now, outside the Maryland game, on why their offense has been struggling?
So I think it's a combination of things. I'll first start with their offensive line is serviceable, but I don't think it's super, super good. Olu is a really, really good player. He's played a lot better this year, but again, a lot of his draft prospect status is based more on his projection. He's super athletic, super long arms. NFL teams love that, especially at the tackle position. Um, the interior of the Penn State's offensive line hasn't looked too great in the few times I've watched it. Again, Ohio State's edges really gave him fits all day, and arguably the best group of edges in the conference is the guys they're facing this week. Um, and the group of edges that Michigan has, McGregor's really good, Hare's really good, Moore and Josiah Stewart have came on as of late. So Michigan has four guys that they can rotate in and feel pretty confident in. Um, and I think the offensive line is a big issue to start with. But then I think secondly, the running backs are good, but they're not creators and running backs. And what I mean by that is there's running backs to where you can hand them the ball, and they'll get 3 or 4 yards when they're not really supposed to be getting 3 or 4 yards. Penn State's running backs that aren't to that level yet. Not saying they can't be to that level, but their running backs really get yards whenever there's yards there for them. They get what they're supposed to get, but they don't really give you that extra stuff that you're looking for. And then lastly, their passing game I think is very limited. Part of their problem is I think they pretty much have a full wide receiver room of slots, which is part of the reason why I don't think Aller wants to push the ball downfield. I think the wide receivers aren't good, especially in one-on-one matchups. And whether they're scheming Aller short because he has accuracy issues or whether Aller just doesn't want to throw it downfield. When your average yard per completion is worse than Iowa, something's going wrong in the passing offense. And Penn State is like 120th in the country in yards per completion, which is not really good. And so I think that, the issue kind of stems from a lot of things. I said this in the beginning, I thought that their year was next year, not this year. And I think that as the year's gone on, people started seeing the problems. The offense really hasn't picked itself up. I mean, a lot of people would have or thought would have. And I still think, there's issues at almost every spot in the offense to where they're not really bad, but that's what's holding them back from being elite, being in that Michigan, Ohio State tier, being up there with like Georgia, Alabama, teams like that, teams like Washington, Oregon, who are playing really well right now. When you have so many areas on your offense that's not necessarily elite, that's going to be, you're going to see that a lot more, especially against good teams.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it a little bit with Eller not being, comfortable throwing the ball downfield. And to me, that's what really stood out. I mentioned it to a couple of buddies the past couple of weeks. It's gone up, but his average depth of target, which I look at to figure out, if a quarterback's a check down merchant or what. And out of all the Big Ten quarterbacks who have had 100 dropbacks or more, he's dead last at number 19 at 7.6 average yards per target, or average depth per target. And just to kind of put that into perspective, the average is just under 10.
Mhm.
So he's really just, like you said, he's afraid to throw the ball downfield, it seems like. And part of that might be, I feel like he might be afraid to make a mistake. He's only got one interception on the year. I think that came a couple weeks ago. But I feel like he's just afraid to make a mistake. So he's just taking the safe, under route, which I'll touch on later, but that's not going to work against a team like Michigan.
Mhm.
And, that's just kind of the big reason I think their offense is struggling. And then also with their run game, I was high on their run game coming in, but you gave a good point. They're not creators, and they just haven't lived up to the hype. Kind of like Michigan running back Donovan Edwards. He hasn't had a great
Mhm.
year. I kind of feel like that's the same with both running backs and Penn State's room is they had such high expectations. They're just not really achieving that this year.
Mhm. Yeah, like I said, I think, you a guy like Quorum, he gets the ball and it seems like he's picking up 3 or 4
Mhm.
every play, even when it's not blocked. And then the plays where he does get good blocking, he's making guys miss. He's getting, 15, 20, even more out of runs that most running backs would go for, 8, 9, 10 yards. Um, like I said, the Penn State's running backs aren't there yet. And so when the play is not blocked well up front, when you get free hitters from the linebacker position and if safeties get rolling down, they really struggle to make guys miss and to extend plays and get yards after contact. And I think that when you're looking at how Penn State can improve, I think that is an area that they need to look at in the offseason. Because like I said, hopefully, Allard takes a step next year. I mean, if you can get a pretty strong running game to go with that, like I said, next year should be the year to where if they don't push for a Big Ten title, push for, It's going to be expanded playoffs, so you'd assume that they're going to make it in there, 10-2 or 11-1. If they don't push, for a semifinal appearance next year, then at least Penn State fans should start asking the question: Is James Franklin the guy to get us to that next level?
Yeah, no, and I offered that
Mhm.
question up actually to a couple of my Penn State friends after the loss to Ohio State. And I don't know off the top of my head, but James Franklin against ranked teams is just horrible.
Mhm.
Um, and I kind of offered that question, like if he can't get it going against Michigan this year and then next year, with what I think is going to be a better team next year, if he can't get it going, is it time to put him on the hot seat? And surprisingly, they said no, which I think a lot of
Mhm.
that might be a little biased. I know Penn State fans have a weird love hate relationship with Franklin, but to
Mhm.
me, he's just if he can't, you know, lock up a playoff spot easily next year at even 10-2, with the team he'll have, it's time for him to, maybe start looking for another job or Penn State's just to boot him.
Mhm.
But enough about Penn State. Moving on, Texas. Early on they were looking like a really good team. Um, do you think they're still a playoff team without Quinn Ewers? They struggled late against Kansas State, I believe it was. They
Mhm.
almost blew a big lead there. Do you think they could still be a playoff team that could sneak in as like a 4 seed?
Um, I maybe with Quinn, I just question whether they're a playoff team in general.
Mhm.
Um, I just there's a few holes there. The Big 12, I think, starting to show cracks. They're
Yeah.
starting to kind of beat up on each other a little bit. Um, Not saying they're going to lose the second game, but I would not be surprised if they lose the second game, even with Ewers. And I really think that a lot of people should start having the conversation of the Big 12 playing themselves out of the playoffs, because Texas is their last hope. So if Texas loses the second game, the Big 12 is not going to have a playoff representative. Um, and I think Texas plays TCU this week,
Yep.
which could be a little bit difficult for them. I know TCU is not what they were last year, but I don't think Texas is good enough to play bad and win. They played bad and beat Kansas State, but that was just because Kansas State's head coach made one of the dumbest decisions I've ever seen. Um, to go for two in overtime there when I didn't think he need to. Kansas State kind of had all the momentum. I
Yeah.
thought he should have, you know, took the extra point and then got the ball on offense and really put the pressure on what was really a Texas offense is kind of stuck in mud.
Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, like I said, even when yours comes back, I'm not necessarily super sold on Texas. Um, and I do think that there's some holes, especially on the defensive side, where they do kind of lose focus, for lack of a better term, at times. And I wouldn't be surprised if they even lose a second game. I really think that they got to win out. And if they do, they're going to be the 4 seed playing Georgia or Michigan team that I think is going to be considerably better than them.
Yeah. No, no, I agree. And my issue with them, they're kind of like the Big 12 is kind of like the Pac 12 last year. They just played themselves
Yeah.
out. But they're ranked seventh right now. Are they better than an 8-1 Oregon? By far, no. In my opinion, I think Oregon's really good.
Nope.
Are they better than Washington? No. Are they better than Florida State? No. Even though I don't think Florida State is like an insane 9-0 team,
Mm-hmm.
but to me, just those three teams above them, they'll really need to look really impressive the next 4 games, included that includes the Big 12 championship, and then they'll need Oregon, Washington, and then probably Michigan and Ohio State, one of those to get knocked out.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the Pac-12 to beat each other up. But no, with yours early on, I thought, okay, they're a playoff team. They should be able to win out and grab that fourth spot. That was before Washington. I looked this impressive, and same with Oregon. Um, but moving on to Washington and Oregon, actually, um, who do you think the best team in the Pac-12 is? USC is now garbage in my opinion, but it's between Washington and Oregon in my opinion. Who do you like more?
I like Oregon a little bit more. I'm not saying Washington's a bad team. I just think Oregon has a better defense. Washington's defense is really struggled. Washington almost lost to that Arizona State team, which really could have thrown a clunk into their season.
Yeah.
But I do like Oregon's defense a little bit better. And I don't think Oregon's offense is that much worse to really make it. Um, to really make them kind of uncomparable to Washington in a way.
Mhm.
And so I do like Oregon, and it'd be really interesting to see if those two teams play against each other again. Because if they do, Washington might find themselves as the regular season conference champs, and then sitting at home come playoff time if they lose to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. Um, so I do think that it'll be very interesting to see them play if they play a second time. Oregon did leave some points in the first game, and that kind of came back to bite them. I think twice Manning went for it inside their own 30 on fourth down and didn't get it. Kick a field goal twice right there. That's the difference between winning and losing. So I do think that Oregon left some points on the board the first time. I don't think Manning would be as aggressive knowing what he knows now. So I do think if they played again, Oregon probably win. I do think Oregon's the better team of the two, even though they lost to Washington earlier.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think Oregon's the slightly better team because of their defense. Both offenses are just insane, in my opinion. Both quarterbacks are great, and it really comes down to defense between the two, in my opinion. And Washington's defense looks slightly better than USC, which isn't saying much considering USC's defense is horrible. So that's kind of where I have them. And then Oregon's defense looks much better. And if both those teams do play each other, I do have Oregon winning. um, what it'll do to the playoffs, I'm not sure. Um, both teams will have one loss. It'll probably depend what Ohio State or Michigan is at. Um, if Ohio State loses to or Michigan, they're 11-1. Do you leave Ohio State out for 12-1 Oregon, or do you sneak Ohio State back in there? Um, and to me, we can kind of talk about that a little bit. I guess we can add that to our list, but to me, the committee ranking Ohio State 1, to me that sets them up to get into the playoff, even if they lose to Michigan. Um, I think it'll take an undefeated Pac-12 team to officially knock them out of playoff contention. But um, what are your thoughts on that? I know I wasn't on the list, but
I thought I don't. I find it really tough right now unless people start to lose for the loser of that Michigan Ohio State game to get in.
Mhm.
Kind of worked out last year for them to get in, even though Ohio State's number one. Um, you run into the problem of so if Michigan would beat Ohio State. I think they jump Georgia. I think they put Michigan at number one. I think they keep Georgia at number two, at least going into conference championship games. And then you run into the problem to where both those teams take care of business. The committee they really try to avoid two conference teams playing each other.
Yeah, they hate that.
So if especially in the semifinals. So if Michigan is the one, to me, there's no way Ohio State can be four or three because one, they're not going to jump Florida State, who is presumably undefeated, up to three, so they can put them into the playoffs. And then two, if Michigan's the number one team in the country, they're not going to put them in at four because they don't want two conference teams playing in the semifinals.
Yeah.
So I really think that the only way the loser of the game, provided both those teams go undefeated and go into that game 11-0, I think the only way they really sneak into the playoffs is if the Big 12 takes itself out and the Pac-12 finds a way to kind of self-destruct itself, and that Pac-12 winner has two losses. Then at that point, the loser does have a chance to sneak in, but Alabama is still kind of lurking there. So again, Alabama potentially winning the SEC West and then upsetting Georgia in the SEC championship game could also throw a wrench in everything too. So I do think that the playoff picture is pretty muddy. And I think at this point in the year, if you don't make it to championship weekend, you're probably not getting in the playoffs.
Okay. No. Yeah, I never really thought about the whole they don't like playing conference teams in the semis. I always forget about that rule. So it would probably take the committee saying Georgia's one, Michigan's two. We'll throw
Mhm.
Ohio State at four, and then. But I think if Ohio State loses, I think they should be out regardless. I'd rather have a one-loss Washington or Oregon in there. I think both those teams are better, in my opinion. But speaking of Alabama, they've quietly been sneaking back up the rankings after a slow start to the year. Um, do you think they can pose a threat to Georgia and sneak into the playoffs?
I do think they can sneak in the playoffs. If they went out, they're going to be in. Your 12-1 conference champ, SEC or SEC champ is going to get in. But again, I'm a firm believer. Once you lose twice, you're out of the playoffs. You got your room for error is one loss, and even sometimes that's not enough. In Alabama's case, they have the schedule ahead of them, and they have the opportunity to get to 12-1 and sneak in, but um, they have to win out. Um, if they even if they would lose and win the SEC at 11-2, I don't think they're getting in the playoffs. Two lost teams not going to get in the playoffs. If there's four one-loss teams, or four teams with one or zero losses, so I think Alabama has to win out, and that's the only chance they got.
Okay. Now let me ask you this: Alabama schedule is super easy the rest of the year.
Mm.
So assuming they win out, they win the West, they'll play Georgia. Do you think right now, watching both teams, do you think that's going to be all Georgia, or do you think it's going to be Alabama giving Georgia a run for their money?
I think we lean Georgia. The I Milrow has played well recently. I still don't. I'm not sold on him.
Okay.
I really think if you can make him sit back and read a defense and throw the ball and become more of a on schedule passer, I really think you're in a good spot against Alabama. You really get killed against Milrow whenever he can kind of go off schedule, do things on his own. That's really where he gets you. And so I think if you kind of keep him on schedule, I don't think he will do enough against that Georgia defense to really make it close.
All right. Yeah, I'd have to go with Georgia too. I think with the way they're playing much better football. And
Mhm.
even though Alabama has been playing better, I still think Georgia um, should handle them. But before we preview some of the games coming up this weekend, um, we can do a top 10. We did it last episode a few weeks ago. So starting off with number 10, who do you have?
Give me a second. Let me put it up here. Uh, for number 10, I got Penn State.
Okay.
Yep. So like I said, I think they're good. But like I said, I think that the difference between, the top 4 or 5 is pretty far between, next group.
Mhm.
And I do think that Penn State's defense makes them a lot better than a lot of other teams because of how good that defense is. So I kind of have Penn State. I'm sitting at 10 at the moment.
Well, I agree with you. Penn State, just thinking about the teams next closest to sneaking in that top 10, it would be probably Louisville. And I think Penn State would be
Mhm.
Louisville. I think Louisville's a little overrated for a one loss team, but yeah, so I have Penn State at 10. I don't think, I think if there are more, like, I think if USC, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Notre Dame, LSU, I think if those teams would be better,
Yep.
they'd all be above Penn State. Um, I don't think Penn State's super impressive, but yeah, I have them at 10 as well.
Yep.
Number 9.
Number 9, I got Texas.
Okay.
I like I said, I don't think they're as good as a lot of people think they are, and I honestly would say that if them and Alabama played again, Alabama probably wins. That's why I kind of have Texas sitting at number 9, which is where I had them last time. Like I said, I'm not saying they're a bad team, but I do think that they kind of fallen back to the pack a little bit.
Yeah, I also have Texas at number 9. Part of it being without they don't have their starting quarterback, and I think that plays a major role in how a team is right now. And like I mentioned earlier, I kind of rank teams based on who I think would be favored, um, at this moment in time. But and then also Texas, outside of the BYU game, the past 3 weeks have been they've struggled. They haven't been looked great. If it wasn't for a bad spot at Houston, I think they would have ended up losing that game.
Mm.
And then a coaching mistake against Kansas State, they probably would have lost that game as well. So I have them at 9 also. Number 8, who do you have?
Number 8, I got Alabama.
Okay.
Um, like you said, I do think there's some questions there, but they're definitely playing better as of late. Um, and so I do think that Alabama is that I think they're going to make some noise here down the stretch. I bet they'll probably play an SEC championship game, but I don't see them getting much past that. So I kind of have Alabama sitting at 8 right now.
I have Ole Miss here at 8. A big part of that is
Mhm.
really since Bama, they've only had one game where they didn't win by only one score.
Mhm.
It's not like they're playing anyone super impressive. They're playing LSU, who's the best team they've played since, Arkansas, who's horrible, Auburn, who's not very good, Vandy, and Texas A&M. So it's to me, I have them below Alabama, mainly because they're just squeaking by right now, against some teams opposed to Bama, who's been kind of beating some teams up pretty easily.
Yep.
So then that moves us to number seven, right? Or the number.
Yes.
All right, number seven. Who do you have?
Number seven, I have Ole Miss, partly just because I think they're a more complete team than Alabama. I do think Alabama still has some offensive deficiencies, um, which I think do pose kind of a threat to them. Um, and so even though I think Alabama beat Ole Miss a few weeks ago, I do think Ole Miss is a slightly better team at the moment.
Yeah, and this is where I have Bama. As I just mentioned, I have them over Ole Miss, because they've been beating teams a little
Mhm.
better than Ole Miss has. But moving on to number six.
Number six, I have Oregon.
Oregon.
And like I said, I think I do think that being undefeated at this point uh, really kind of puts you ahead of the rest of the pack. And so I do think that um, Oregon kind of deserves to be sitting at number six, uh, kind of sitting there. And they're, like I said, it's kind of self-explanatory. They have a good defense, have a good offense. And so I don't see any issue with them at six.
Yep. I also have them at six for the same exact reason. They have one loss, and I think the teams that are undefeated, in Power Five conferences, I think those teams deserve to be ranked higher,
Yep.
um, at the moment. So pretty easy there. But moving on to the undefeated teams, who do you have at number five?
Number five, I got Florida State. I do think Washington is slightly better than Florida State. I'm not sold on Florida State quite yet. I do think that their offense kind of goes through times where they really don't move the ball. I don't like their defense too much. I don't think their defense is super, super good. It's not a bad defense, but I don't think when you compare them to a lot of the top defenses, I don't think they're really close to that. And so because I think um, Washington's at least elite on one side of the ball, I do think that gives them an advantage, and so that's why I have Florida State sitting at five.
I also have Florida State there. A lot of the reason is when I just watch Washington, I come away so impressed with their offense, and I do the exact opposite with Florida State. They're kind of boring, I guess I would say, compared to Washington and Oregon and teams like that. Um, so I have Florida State at five. I do think they have the best chance though, um, between Washington, Oregon, and Florida State. I think they have the best chance to get into the playoff with their schedule. But for right now, I think they're the fifth best team.
Yep.
So number four now.
Number four is going to be Washington for me. I'm kind of like I said, they at least have a pretty elite one side of the ball on offense. I do think the defense is a cause for concern, and I think if they play, especially some of the teams around them, but especially the teams ahead of them, that they're almost going to be forced to be perfect on offense to win those games. And so for that, I have them at four.
I I also have Washington at four. Um, I was debating earlier, I'm not going to lie, between Washington and Ohio State, who I mentioned earlier with my number three team. Um, mainly just because
Mhm.
Washington's offense looks so impressive compared to Ohio State's offense. And I know I keep coming back to Washington's offense, but um, for me, the kind of the big reason I kept Ohio State above Washington was that game against Arizona State, where it felt like they struggled, a lot, and then also their defense it's not good enough for me to say okay,
Mhm.
they're a better team than Ohio State. But number three, I just kind of said I had Ohio State, but who do you have?
Yep, I also have Ohio State. I said their defense is really good. I Their offense is better than a lot of people give them credit for. I don't think it's a very, very bad offense. I just think people are so used to seeing this like world class Ohio State offense that's so efficient, so effective, good at everything. That they're not really used to seeing Ohio State have a more pedestrian kind of offense. But I don't think it's a bad offense. I think it's one of the better offenses in college football, and I think it's one of the better offenses when you compare these top teams. And so for that reason, I have them at number three.
Yep, my big reason why I have them at number three, below Michigan or Georgia, kind of like I touched on earlier. When I watch the games, I I think it's pretty clear that they're not better than Washington or Michigan and
Mhm,
Georgia. And I think both teams would be favored by a touchdown against Ohio State right now
mhm.
on a neutral field. Um, but your number two and number one team.
My number two is Michigan, and then my number one is Georgia. Um, I think you'll learn a lot about Michigan this week, but I do think the way Georgia's played is late, especially kind of given with their track record, they deserve to be number one.
Mhm.
When you win two national championships in a row and are undefeated, I don't think you really can move them out of that number one spot unless they lose. Um, and again, I think Michigan, they might, some could argue they're the best team in college football, but you'll really learn a lot about them here over the next 3 weeks. Um, and if they come out of these next weeks 3-0, you probably have a very, very, very strong argument to even move Michigan ahead of Georgia at that point. But for now, Michigan will be sitting at two, and Georgia's at number one.
Yep, I have the same. And last time we did the top 10, I had it
Mm,
flipped. I had Georgia two, Michigan one, and mainly because Georgia just wasn't looking like Georgia.
mm,
Now they're starting to look like Georgia again. And what really impresses me is they're doing it without Brock Bowers, who I think is he could arguably be named the best player in all of college football
mm,
overall. So the fact that after their bye week they've just looked like Georgia again without Brock Bowers, I think that's the reason why for me they're number one at the moment. But I do think it'll depend what Michigan looks like against Penn State. If Michigan goes out there and wins by 30 like they have been, I'd say Michigan's number one.
mm.
If they go out and even win by 15 to 20, I'd say you can make a strong case. Um, but anything, two scores or less, I'd say Georgia still, regardless of
Mm.
Michigan victory.
Yeah, like I said, especially on the offensive side of the ball, if Michigan can really give that Penn State defense fits and put up 30, 35, 40 points, I really think you kind of start to think there at that point, okay, maybe this is the most complete team in college football.
Mhm.
But like I said, you'll learn a lot about them over the next few weeks. And so you'll get a more clear picture here, um, especially after this week and kind of where everyone's sitting.
Yep, yep. Speaking of Michigan, I kind of thought them going to Maryland after Penn State before Ohio State, I thought that would have been a trap game, but Maryland looks horrible all of a sudden. So
Yeah, Maryland's kind of become a get right game. I mean,
yeah,
every team that's played Maryland the last few weeks has figured something out and had a season best game against them, which is not where you want to be. It's kind of a trend with Loxley led Maryland teams is that they kind of get progressively worse as the year goes on.
yeah,
Um, and like I said, a lot of people thought that they could have maybe pushed for that top three in the East, but they're kind of back to where they were 2 years ago. And so I really don't see Michigan having any problem, especially if they do beat Penn State. A lot of people forgot that this Maryland game now would be for win number 1,000 in program history. So the program or the team would have kind of that reason to go up there. Even though it would be cool to have your 1,000th win against Ohio State, I don't think anyone wants to lose to Maryland the week before the game because that would put a sour taste in everyone's mouth.
yeah. No, yep. I always thought it was a trap game, and now I'm thinking it's just more of
Mm.
a clean up some stuff against that team and get ready for Ohio State when it comes to Michigan.
Yeah.
All right.